Bundle up and mark your calendars because Blue Door's signature event is back. Join us on February 22nd for Blue Door's coldest night of the year Richmond Hill fundraising walk sponsored by Home Trust. This is more than just a 2 or 5 kilometer walk. It's a chance to come together and make a difference. You can register, sponsor, volunteer, and fundraise in support of vulnerable individuals experiencing hunger, hurt, and homelessness in your community. For event details, visit cnoy.org/Richmond Hill. Let's change the tune for people in need because it's cold out there. Together, we can make a difference. See you on February 22nd.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.
Hello, friends, and welcome to On the Way Home. If it's your first time listening, thank you. And if you're coming back, thank you even more. My name is Michael Braithwaite, and I'm with Blue Door organization in York Region, Peel Region, Durham Region, helping very vulnerable people with their housing journey, their health journey, and their employment journey. Learn more about us at bluedoor.ca and the wonderful people doing life-saving and changing work there. Speaking of life-saving and changing work, I have 3 awesome guests today. It's a brilliant conversation. I'm so excited for this podcast. We have Jeff Schlemmer, who's the Executive Director at the Community Legal Clinic in York Region, just a brilliant dude. Annie Hodgins is the Executive Director at the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, and Annie's wonderful and just so well informed. And we have Diana Chan McNally, who's a community advocate like none I've ever seen before, just so powerful and smart and brilliant. Also works for The Shift right now. So we talk about today, we talk about their journeys into the sector. And very, it makes sense when you hear it. Very cool. We talk about the legal case at Kitchener-Waterloo that really enforced the law that Jeff told us was already in place. That really just said you can't just evict people from encampments if you don't actually have a really suitable place for them to go. Right? It's just not any place in broad strokes. We talk about that case, what that meant. Then we talk about the how it came about that a bunch of mayors actually sent a letter to Doug Ford around the notwithstanding clause, using that if they had to help clear encampments. We talk about that process, how that all came about, what it means now, if it's written into legislation that, if you're going to criminalize the use of drug use outside when you've shut down supervised consumption sites. We talk about what they're hearing throughout the province. Diana's traveled around quite a bit. We talk about the right to housing. I mean, you have to listen to this podcast. It's a great conversation around this. It really helps you wrap your head around this whole conversation that's happening across the province of Ontario, hopefully not to be duplicated. It's a long podcast because we've got 3 brilliant people sharing their dropping knowledge on you. So let's go to that podcast. I think you'll enjoy it as much as I did. Let's go to it now. Diana, Jeff, Annie, thanks so much for taking time out of your very, very busy schedules to join us on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, listen, we ask the same question to all our guests when they come on because it's a personal question to people. I'm always interested in the response. Now, Diana and Annie, I believe you've both had practice at this, but sometimes things change a bit depending on your situation. The question is, of course, what does home mean to you? Jeff, because you're a first-timer answering this, I believe. Jeff, we're going to go with Jeff, Diana, and then end with Annie.
Okay. Well, home to me, I'm a good old boy from Canada's deep south, which is Southern Ontario, a small town. And for me, home is where my family is. And I'm extremely blessed that I have my wife and I, we have 4 kids and 8 grandkids. And for me, home is being with all of them. That's where I get all my energy and strength from.
For me, what is home? I mean, I spend so much time thinking about and working in the midst of homelessness. Sure, there's a brick and mortar aspect to that, but I think I agree with Jeff. It's who lifts you up, who you love. Those people are essentially your home. The people that you always return to and the people that you always feel safe with. But ideally as well, you're going to have a roof over your head. So there's that factor as well, that practical building.
I would say for you too, home is where your records are, right? I mean, wherever they are, that's where we'll find it, right?
Yep.
Got like a small bucket in the corner. I thought I was doing well. Annie, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, agree. A place, I think, family, culture, and increasingly I've been thinking about safety because we released our Nowhere to Go report. And I've just been thinking about how important it is to be able to come home at the end of the day and feel just safe and warm and secure. And so that's sort of been top of mind for me. And I actually moved around quite a lot as a child. And so, it's really where your family is, I think. And as Diana said, the people that lift you up.
Very cool. Thank you all for that. Beautiful and very, very consistent with a lot. Like a lot of people talk about safety, security, where it starts, where it ends, family, comfort to where you feel the most comfortable. So thanks for that. Let's tell me a little bit about your journey into your current work. Annie, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Diana, and then Jeff will end with you.
Sure. So I've been working in the sector for about over a decade now, and I know Diana quite well from all that work we've been doing. But I studied history, as I mentioned last time, and I had a really particular focus on political movements across the past century and social history. And my studies focused on women's emancipation, and then also sort of the history of early psychology and how it pathologized certain populations. And so, that brought me to wanting to work on an issue of, importance to society. And when I entered this sector, I worked directly with people facing eviction into homelessness. And so that's sort of always been my focus. And it kind of I've worked at Center for Equality, Rights and Accommodation, and now Canadian Center for Housing Rights for 11 years. And it's been sort of a journey sort of through all the different types of work we do. But it really was that focus on, wanting to build better social systems that support and protect people in Canada.
Okay. How did I get to where I am now? I'll tell you, it's not a straight line. I'm actually an art historian. Weirdly, we both have history backgrounds, so did a BFA as well as master's in curatorial studies, which I have never used. Also have a master's of education, which I do use sometimes, but ultimately I ended up being a teacher actually at what is now TMU and Centennial and George Brown, teaching mostly design, weirdly. And I ended up having a lot of international students who were coming here, but were coming from countries where they weren't necessarily able to get refugee status, but were clearly coming here for safety reasons. And I was just so angry about it because we were charging an arm and a leg. We're talking international fees for people to receive safety. And I just ended up being a case manager to everybody. Ended up quitting because I just couldn't be a part of that anymore. Went to George Brown in the community worker program, and then came out to work with homeless people. So really kind of just a very odd trajectory in there. But, I also have my own experiences of being homeless as a teenager. And, for me, it's also been something I think I avoided for about 10 years. I didn't want to talk about it or think about it, but now it's very important to me to continue to do this work. So lots of weird reasons why I'm in here, but very glad to be doing this kind of work.
Okay. So in my case, as I mentioned, I'm from a small town in fairly conservative southern Ontario. And when I started practicing, it was at a big firm doing insurance law, defense law, and commercial litigation and personal injury, catastrophic injury work. And I did that for 5 years. And then no fault auto insurance came in, and I liked the personal injury work, didn't really like the other work. And was not particularly good at, I would say, representing banks and land developers. It just did not get me up in the morning. So I went to a vocational psychologist and had an assessment done. And he came back and said, you have Boy Scout syndrome. You will only be satisfied if you're helping the underdog. So you need to find a job where you can do that. And I wasn't really familiar with legal clinics, but an ad came up for one not too long after that. And I applied, and that was in 1990. So I've been a clinic lawyer ever since, and it still gets me up every morning. I love the work that I do. I love the fact that we get to act for the underdogs in society, and I think it's awesome that we have a a province that funds that. We're unique in the world as far as we know. We have 70 legal clinics. The province spends $100 million a year on them, 1,000 employees in the clinics. And I think it's very structurally healthy for our democracy that they fund us to fight them and to sue them, and like the Ombudsman's Office and the Auditor General. So that's how I ended up where I am. I've been executive director for, I guess, about 25 years now, and love doing that because I love being able to do things my own way. I have my music on quietly at my desk every day on my phone, and nobody tells me to shut it off. So I like being the boss.
Listen, all of those stories make total sense, right? I mean, yeah, just all the different journeys into this work. And I often say, like, when you're in grade 2 or 3 and they're saying, what do you want to be when you grow up? None of us would have said this. Although we probably showed some of the tendencies to stick up for other people, or like you are who you are, right, at an early age, is my guess too. And you, all three of you, are doing incredible work around advocacy. Tell us a little bit about your focus or where, like, your organization. Diana, we're going to start with you. I mean, you can't really, can't turn on a television or a news station without seeing Diana pop up. She is one of our sector's, like, just most fierce advocates, and thankfully so. And listen, that Masters of Ed comes in handy. You just speak so well and so passionately and so beautifully. It's so appreciated. Talk to me about what do you focus on these days?
I will also note that I was a drama kid too, so that does help. In terms of what I focus on, I think, for the last 4 years or so since the pandemic, really 2020, I've been focusing on human rights and equity issues for people living in encampments. That was partly frontline. Throughout the pandemic, I was working relief at All Saints, where Annie is one of the board directors. That's also how we know each other. But also overseeing a network of about 59 drop-ins across the city of Toronto. And we were some of the only spaces that stayed open. At the beginning of the pandemic, the only 10 public bathrooms available in all of Toronto. So understanding just how dire it was for people to receive any resources, it just seemed natural to move into the space of all of these people are trapped. They're trapped outdoors. What can we do to ensure that they have the necessities of life? And we've been doing this battle ever since. And for a while there, it was slightly better. We were moving toward a direction, I think, that, I've really been working hard on since 2021, but now we're starting to backslide with new legislation, as we will certainly talk about in the near future. Right now, I am working for The Shift. I originally participated in some of their work just as a frontline worker, informing some of the kinds of documents that they were putting out. And so one would be the municipal guidance on encampments, and was a member of the National Working Group on Encampments, and apparently am okay enough to also work there, which I'm very, very, very happy about. And it's somewhere I've wanted to work for a long time. So I'm feeling good, even though the fight is very exhausting.
No, it makes perfect sense. I'm so glad you're there as well, because they do amazing work. It's a great fit. Annie, tell us a little bit about your organization. What do you focus on?
Yeah, so we've been around for about 40 years. We used to be called the Center for Equality, Rights and Accommodation. And then about 3 years ago, we went through a bit of a rebranding, re-strategizing phase after a period of sort of a lot of community work. And we wanted to really get back to our roots as a international advocacy organization. When we were founded, we did a lot of work on what became the right to housing, and bringing international standards to domestically. Also a lot of work on the Ontario Charter human rights legislation. And we, over the last 3 years, we've grown about sixfold. We've expanded a lot. We now have about 27 people working across the country. And we just launched our next strategic plan. So there's a lot of things we're working on, and I didn't want to kind of go on for too long. So we've got, as I said, 27 staff. We've got a research team that does academic level research. We're partnered with nearly half a dozen universities, including U of T, University of Saskatchewan, and Carleton, on various different initiatives. There's a big focus on data, and if you're not counted, you don't count in policy, unfortunately. So a lot looking at where the numbers are missing in terms of what the housing need is, people that are losing their homes. We're really, we've been focused on the right to housing in earnest for the last several years, but this strategic plan, we really saw the need to focus on affordability and security of tenure. So, you know, there's been lots and lots of talk about increasing supply by building, but we're losing so much affordable housing every day. There have been estimates that we're losing up to 15 homes for every one built. So we're really focusing our efforts on policy and research that helps keep people housed and helps increase the supply of affordable housing and social housing. So the research efforts are really focused on that. We've got the low end of rental housing monitor, which is a digital map showing where deeply affordable housing is existing. And we're hoping to match that with efforts for acquiring that housing by, you know, nonprofit housing providers, social housing providers. We're doing work on hidden homelessness, eviction prevention, and healthcare. We're looking right now at a project where people are discharged from institutions into homelessness, and so lots of work on the research front. We're also doing quite a bit of policy work with a very, very small but mighty team. I'll just highlight sort of a couple of things. We've been doing the right to housing in Toronto since 2019, which is a group of diverse advocates and people with lived experience, bringing, you know, policy monitoring and recommendations to the city. And then we're really working on a national Renters Bill of Rights project. So the federal government announced a Renters Bill of Rights. We've been speaking with them. We've been bringing the community together for consultations and really trying to press for what we've been calling minimum standards. So we've been wanting to do a project and working on a project for several years that, you know, across the country, legislation differs depending on where you are. Your rights in your housing depend, if you're a renter, on where you're located, and that needs to be fixed. So the Renters Bill of Rights is an opportunity to do that as we see it. And then we're also doing services work. So we work on the front lines with people facing eviction. We provide legal advice, information, and representation. We don't advertise that work, and we get about 3,000, you know, inquiries every year. We're funded by 2 municipalities to do that work, and we also have a pro bono program that matches people with private bar lawyers for representation. And all the work we do complements the amazing work that the Legal Aid Ontario clinics do. So as Jeff is going to speak to. And then we also do a lot of education. So free to renters, we do rights-based education, and increasingly we're working with supportive housing providers and social service agencies on rights-based training. So lots of different initiatives. I could go on for longer, but I think I've gone on long enough. So
I'm tired just like listening to that. I mean, wow, awesome. And incredible. And thank you for the work that you do. And Jeff, you're up in York Region. Talk about, I'm familiar with your team because they're doing incredible in life-changing work. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so our legal clinic is one of 70 in Ontario. Every part of Ontario has a legal aid clinic funded by Legal Aid Ontario, ultimately by the Ontario government mostly. Ours happens to have 27 staff. It happens to be the biggest legal clinic in Canada, which is kind of neat. So it gives us a bit of a perspective. I was thinking about how, having done this work since 1990, I was thinking about how things have changed. So in 1990, when I started, we did very few eviction cases for rent arrears because shelter allowances for welfare at that point were sufficient that people could pay the rent. And so you just didn't really see that. You didn't see homeless people because, again, they could get welfare and go and rent a place. And there were a lot more social programs. Also, the governments were building tens or if not hundreds of thousands of social housing units at that time. The federal government was building a lot and had been since 1947. And then they got out of the biz, downloaded it to the province in 1993, but Bob Rae was building a ton of it. And so when you look at most of the newer social housing in Ontario, it was built by Bob Rae before 1995. When the Harris government came in, they privatized it by canceling 20,000 units and said, our landlord friends in the private sector will house our most vulnerable people, and we will pay what it costs to rent from them. And that worked great until about 5 or 6 years ago when the rents went up substantially, and the government decided not to come along and decided, well, we're just not prepared to pay that. We'll offer you half of what it costs to rent. And so the landlord said, that's fine. We will evict your vulnerable people that you're looking after, and we won't rent to them, and they will be homeless. And thus we have a homeless crisis. We do try to focus on, so most of our work, most of my lawyers and paralegals, licensed paralegals, do casework. So they're representing people. And the way that we came to this issue was through eviction work that we do a lot of. And we noticed evictions going through the roof. And it happened then that a dear friend of mine who's a social advocate in Barrie contacted us to see if we could help them with the bylaw there that they were passing to say that it was illegal to give something to a person in the park. And that's how we sort of got involved in it. And then from there, we sort of had a look at it, and we were aware that our sister clinic in Waterloo was defending a case in relation to homelessness, and one in Kingston. It happened that my director of legal services, Sharon Crow, came from the Hamilton Clinic, where she had started a case against the city of Hamilton in relation to homelessness there. And so we've sort of gotten into it indirectly. And I was thinking, 10 years ago, our big issue was the horrible quality of medical determinations for Ontario Disability Support Benefits. And that was our big focus at that time. And so now we think the biggest crisis facing our client community of low-income Ontarians is homelessness. In fact, I think it's the worst thing that's happened in my career. And there's no end in sight. There's no plan to reduce it, to reduce the increasing part of it. The government's not going to pay what the private sector is charging for rent, and increasingly people will be evicted. So anyway, so I mean, it's a great job where we have a lot of representation. We have lawyers. Sharon right now is doing the case in Hamilton today, where she is fighting Bay Street lawyers from Gowlings, one of the biggest firms in Canada, on behalf of the homeless folks in Hamilton. And it's awesome that we have the resources to be able to do that, to be able to help a lot of people facing eviction, and to be able to sort of poke our heads up every so often and go, so what are the broader issues that are going on here? What if anything can we do about that?
Yeah, incredible work, Jeff, and the work in Barrie. And now you just touched on it. So the case in Kitchener-Waterloo, this is a human right. So the federal government a few years back said we recognize the human right to housing. And then it didn't really have any teeth. So most people were like, so what does that mean? Okay, so what are you going to do about it? How does someone do that? And then a case came up. And it was kind of that David and Goliath. You mentioned that before. And I think when talking to them, we've had them on the podcast to talk about that case where she said, I didn't think we were going to win because it was, she actually isn't even a trial lawyer, right? Who did that case, right? So
that was her.
Yeah, and she did, which was great. Yes. Can you talk a little bit more? What happened there? How did it change things?
Well, so the region of Waterloo decided that they wanted to evict an encampment that was on vacant property owned by the region. And so they decided to go to court to get an injunction to authorize them to do that. And so the Waterloo Clinic stepped up and defended it, and they were successful. The judge accepted that under Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights, there's a right to life, and the right to life includes the right to shelter on public property. And so what the judge said was that before a municipality can evict somebody from public property, they have to offer them what they call truly accessible accommodation. And that means more than just a shelter bed. If it's a couple, it has to be a place that will accommodate couples. If they have pets, they have to accommodate pets. If they have belongings, they have to be able to secure those. If they are active drug users, they have to have a place where they can go. If they're trying to avoid active drug users, they have to have a place that they can go. Because the courts have said that just offering a shelter bed to somebody who can't take one is of no value to anybody. It's just deceitful. So that's what the courts have said. And what's interesting is that this is not new law. This has been the law in Canada for a decade, coming out of the British Columbia Court of Appeal case of Adams. And so this has been the law for a while. And the case in Kingston that followed Waterloo said the same thing. So it's pretty well established law. A lot of people like to think that things changed in Waterloo, but they really didn't. They just applied the existing law. So since then, most municipalities in Ontario have not carried out illegal evictions, which is great, a credit to them, because they're under immense pressure to do that. We're really watching to see what happens in Hamilton to see whether that law affects that or not. If we lose, that could be bad news. Hopefully we will win.
Let's hope. And so this happens. I know that we have some good mayors too in New York region that called and said, what does this really mean? So and I told them to call you because they said you're talking to the wrong person. But saying like, if someone sets up a tent right here in front of and again, they were just actually like curious of, does that mean I have no levers? Like how do I do this? And we talked about there's a right and wrong way to go about working with people. And it starts with housing. We'll talk about that. But more recently, so we've kind of fast forward, and I know there was a group of mayors coming out of a conference that said, we need more support to work with people and support people in encampments. And I'm paraphrasing here, and you can correct me if we need more support, meaning we need more money, and we need to do something to the province. To which then the premier said, well, listen, if you want me to do something, he was encouraging them to encourage him or to ask him to use this notwithstanding clause and to help clear encampments.
Right.
And so I'm hoping that this group can help listeners. So we're just trying to kind of break down all the different facts on this. What does that even mean? What is the notwithstanding clause? When is it used? Why is it even there? And so I'll kind of open it up to the floor. And why would he want them to ask him to use that?
So one thing, if I can just mention, so that initiative originated with the Premier. The Premier has done polling to suggest that this will be a popular issue in the upcoming election, that poor bashing and showing that he's a strong, tough guy and he cleans out the parks is a winner of an issue. And so he had asked Alex Nuttall, who's the mayor in Barrie, if Alex would go to a meeting of the big city mayors and ask if they would agree to ask for help from the province, including use of the notwithstanding clause. The big city mayors said, no, we're not doing that. There's 30 of them, the 30 biggest city mayors in Ontario. So then it became, okay, well, how many will go for it? The mayor, or I should say the premier said, if the cities have any backbone, the mayors will ask me to invoke the notwithstanding clause. So 12 of them came forward of the 30, reneged on the concession agreement that they had with the other ones and wrote the letter. And so the premier got that. Then they opened it up to other mayors and said, okay, forget about just the big 30. There's 440 mayors in Ontario. Let's ask all of them if they would get on board with this letter and ask for notwithstanding. And they got an additional 5. So they ended up with about 20 mayors out of 440. And the press reported this as a movement by the mayors demanding that the premier step in and do this. But of course, it wasn't that at all. But it's been characterized that way very successfully by the premier. The premier doesn't want to touch notwithstanding if he can avoid it, because he's been burned a couple of times, and you're not supposed to use the notwithstanding clause. So that's the problem that he has. He dearly wants to, but he wants someone else to be responsible for it.
Sorry, so just for those people who might not know, notwithstanding clause, he doesn't want to use it. What is it? What does it allow him to do?
Somebody else want to take it?
I can jump in. Yeah, so the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Section 7 guarantees the right to life, liberty, and security of person, among other rights, including a right to be free from discrimination. And then there's a Section 1. And so it's basically saying governments, territorial, provincial, and federal governments have to abide by that when in their actions, including enacting laws. And then they can only really get out of that if they can show that their action is reasonable or demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. The exception is Section 33, the notwithstanding clause that allows actions that would breach people's charter rights. And it's been since 1982 understood as an emergency measure only. But it's really at CCHR we've been increasingly concerned because there's, it's been used recently since 2020 twice, and this would be the third time that it's being proposed to be used. And it's never been used this way before. And we're particularly concerned because it's actually, the charter is supposed to protect the most vulnerable and marginalized and equity equity-seeking and deserving people in our society, and now it's being sort of used for the opposite purpose if this went forward. So just wanted to jump in there because that's the piece we've been extremely concerned on, because we don't necessarily do the direct work with encampments because others like Diana are doing such incredible work, but we support that work. And in particular, this legal aspect to the issue is extremely concerning to us.
I want to add too, I mean, Section 33 is a bit of a loophole that's embedded in our charter, which isn't present in similar doctrines across the world. Only we have something like this. And I think the part that's really disturbing is just how normalized it is to even just utter that you're going to invoke this. So, Ralph Klein in the 2000s had threatened to invoke it around same-sex marriage to overturn federal decision-making there. We've had Francois Legault use it, and Ford as well. And so we've never had it used in Ontario before Doug Ford. And so he's very much normalized its usage, and it's never been used at the federal level either. I think what's really scary about this is that when we talk about Section 7 and the right to life, there is no right that is more foundational than that. It's a basis for all of the rights that you enjoy. It literally means the right to not die, the right to be alive. So if we're targeting an entire demographic group, in this case it's homeless people, and you remove that right, what does the charter mean? And what does it mean that other groups may somehow in the future become targeted if they become nuisances to the government at large at the time? So I really worry that it's not just about homelessness, it's also about setting a horrifying precedent where the charter is effectively meaningless in this country. So that's a part that really disturbs me as well.
And if I could just mention, so the impetus for this came from the United States in a case called Grants Pass. So as you know, Donald Trump has stacked the U.S. Supreme Court with far right judges. And so they heard a case about 6 months ago involving Grants Pass, Oregon, who had asked, saying, until that time, the law in the United States was similar to Canada, that if you wanted to evict somebody from an encampment, you had to offer them shelter. And so the Trump-dominated Supreme Court said, well, we don't see any reason you should have to offer them shelter. Why would you do that? So they struck that down. And so now the conservatives in Canada are saying, well, if they can do it, we can do it too. And we've got this Section 33, so let's just use it that way. And again, so one of the myths that you hear is that mayors lack tools to evict people. They're perfectly free to evict people under Canadian law anytime they want, from any place they want, provided they offer them a truly accessible spot first. And what could be more Canadian than that? Saying, we're going to kick you off this space here, but the great news is that we have a better space for you that you will actually want to go to. That's all the law is in Canada. This is what they're fighting so hard, struggling so hard to get rid of. In the States now, I see that we have municipalities now as a result of this who are banning shelters in their cities. So it's illegal to open a shelter in their city. We also have cities that are banning the carrying of pillows and blankets on public streets.
Santa Monica, yeah.
Yep. We have President Trump, who has said that he's going to set up permanent refugee camps for Americans that will be in the country. They will have fences around them. They will live in tents permanently. They will raise their families there. This is the new America. There will be this class of untouchable Americans who live that way. That's his plan for the future. And so some Canadian conservatives look at it and go, that's great. Why can't we do that? I'm struck that we had that once during the Great Depression, but it was because we had a Great Depression going on. We couldn't afford to do anything other than that. We don't have a Great Depression now. Our economy is actually doing pretty well. So this is a policy decision that has been made to say we're just not going to support the folks anymore that we said we would. And it strikes me that under our Constitution, social programs are the responsibility of the province. We had a fellow who came forward and said, please entrust me with that responsibility and I will look after our most vulnerable people. His name is Doug Ford. He said, you can count on me. It's a big responsibility. I will take it on and I will honor it and do well. Now he's in there and he's saying, he keeps saying he's going to look after them, but he doesn't actually provide any funding to do that.
I actually thought he he was quoted as saying, "Just get off your ass and get a job."
Well, that too.
So you get where his mentality's at when he says
Yes.
that whole kind of bootstrap approach that
Yeah.
this is what, and so it tells you where his mentality is when it comes to our most vulnerable. Now, Diana, I want to ask. You've done a lot of work with individuals and organizations working with people living in encampments. What are you seeing across Toronto? We know it's growing, but can you talk to us a little, give us a bit of a feel. What are people saying that are in the encampments? What are the needs that you're seeing or hearing out there?
I mean, the more that they grow, I think the more complex the needs are. Certainly, there's people that I know have been stuck outside, definitely pre-pandemic, now for decades in some cases, but a lot of folks since the pandemic. And it's not a certain kind of person. I think there's this misconception always. And to talk about the charter, people are not protected under Section 15. They're not considered an equity-seeking group if you're homeless, even though obviously you would be the most equity-seeking. I digress. But who is actually in encampments is really counter to, I think, the stereotype that arises in people's minds. And so I think conservatives have been very, very effective at conflating mental illness and drug use with becoming homeless. Whereas we often see that people aren't using drugs or don't live with mental health barriers before they become homeless, but you get stuck on the street for a long time.
Yeah.
These things happen, and it's logical to me and sensible that people would turn to whatever they can get their hands on in order to mitigate what they're living through, which is just pure traumatizing survival mode. Now, again, it's not that kind of person, though, that, again, is arising in everyone's minds, the criminal person who can't stop using drugs, who's violent. I see a lot more seniors now. That seems to be the group that I see the most. Actually, people over the age of 70 who, for whatever reason, can't access OAS, GIS. They're not able to find somewhere that is affordable for them to live. Like, quite frankly, the market rent is far above what they're actually able to access. And so we have a lot of seniors who are now living in encampments. I also see a lot of young people because the unemployment rate is so high, particularly among that age demographic. So those are the two groups that I'm seeing more and more and more of. And women as well.
Very, very vulnerable groups we're talking about here,
Very,
right?
very vulnerable.
Can I just say that? So that's a good point. That it's not. This isn't all Doug Ford. That's all federal.
Yes.
So the federal government is responsible for looking after our seniors, and so they have Canada Pension, Old Age Security, and Guaranteed Income Supplement. Those have gone up by 29% in the last decade, where rents have gone up by 120%. So of course they can't afford to continue to live, and that's all on Justin Trudeau.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots of blame to go around, but I like how you talk about that, Jeff, that there's different pieces here. It's not simply one. Quite often we want to point the finger one way, and there's lots of blame to go around. And so now this new legislation has been brought up. There's some dollars attached. This was just last week. They said we're going to give some dollars, or there's some money here, and maybe that's just, and this is through Calandra and Ford. But then they talk about fining and criminalizing homelessness. So can we talk a little bit about what, if you can, in more intelligent terms, break that down for me? What was brought forward last week and what it means?
I'll defer to others on the specifics, but I just wanted to sort of add, for us, what was so overwhelming was the desire to, encampments are a visible sort of manifestation of our housing crisis, our housing affordability crisis that's been growing for 30 years, that's been ignored. And so this is a good opportunity to put the investments where they need to be to live out the right to housing, which is, focusing on the housing needs of those who need housing the most. And so it's really, really concerning to see a move towards penalizing the most vulnerable in our society. And that's essentially what we saw here in broad strokes. We saw, penalizing those who just need housing and just need, consultation about where their housing should be and what the housing needs to be. And instead, it's just about clearing that from sight. So that's what sort of really, really concerned us. And the sort of funding attached is not even close to what the need would be. And so big concerns, but I'll turn it over to Jeff and Diana because I think they're closer to the issue.
So again, our main business is defending people facing eviction. And so I can tell you that it's extremely rare that somebody gets evicted because of drug use. but it's very common that they resort to drug use because they've been evicted into homelessness. And so they seek some relief from that to get away for a little bit. And I'm reminded, for example, that I read about in Vietnam that near the end of the war, there was a huge amount of drug use. They were in a losing war, and it was awful. Anyway, most of those soldiers came home and they got jobs and they got on with their lives and they stopped using drugs because their lives were not miserable and horrible, and had families, and on they went. That's what will end drug use amongst homeless people, is getting them a nice place to live where they're happy. That's the only thing that will really work. But unfortunately, there is this. There's a dynamic that's a bit unfortunate with conservatives, which is that you can't be too nice to homeless people because it makes everybody lazy. Nobody will go to work anymore, and so you see that, and so we're seeing that in respect to treatment. So, for example, we know there are long waiting lists to get treatment. I can tell you, I have an adult son who suffers from schizophrenia. Unfortunately, he had a flare up about a month ago and wanted to go to the hospital. He recognized that he needed to go to the hospital, and in decades past he had gone. He was told there's no beds. You cannot go to the hospital. You're just going to have to tough it out at home as best you can. We'll max your meds, and that's all we can do for you. So to say we're going to then ram a bunch of other people onto that waiting list makes no sense whatsoever. There's just no beds, but the province could do something about that if they chose to fund them. That would be a darn good idea. Similarly, my son went through the addiction treatment program at Homewood in Guelph, one of the best addiction treatment programs in Canada. And they said that if you're not ready to quit, it will be unsuccessful. They will only take you if you're ready to quit. So again, this idea that we're going to force them to quit is just unserious, which is perhaps the defining feature of our leaders, is they're not serious. If they were, they would sit down and create a plan. I think, the Premier's a business person. A business that was having a problem would hire a consultant who would develop a plan. They would analyze the problem. They would identify best practices. They would then come up with a plan. They would cost it, and they would propose alternatives. There would be wayposts, annual targets, and so on. And that's how they would solve the problem. But we've seen none of that with the government. They won't even tell us how many homeless people they think there are. And you see these scattershot little announcements of here's 100 beds here, here's 50 beds there, but tied to what? They have no plan, no idea about how to deal with this. And I think that they think that it's too expensive to really look at. But what I believe, and my son is big into artificial intelligence, so I've been getting into that. I did an AI search recently about what would it cost to create tiny cabins for all the homeless people in Ontario. They said, it came back saying, well, it won't cost anything because the savings in healthcare, the savings in policing, the savings in municipal costs, the savings in first responder costs would actually outweigh the cost of putting them into tiny cabins, which they like and will voluntarily leave the parks for. But nobody's talking about that. You will not get a politician to talk about what are we going to do? When are you going to start to take this seriously and stop talking about the notwithstanding clause?
Well, I think with this, honestly, I think it's a bluff. I think this is just a pre-election bluff, and that nothing substantial will come of it. That's my ultimate hope, because there's a lot of things embedded in this legislation which lead me to believe that they don't actually intend to do anything. So I guess the good thing about the legislation is that it doesn't inherently embed the notwithstanding clause in it, and it also doesn't embed involuntary treatment in that. Now, the reason why we don't have involuntary treatment is because the Ford government doesn't intend to actually build the kind of mental health and crisis facilities that people actually need. They don't want to do that. So they didn't put that, they didn't leave it out to be decent people. They left it out because they don't want to spend the money. Like, that's pretty clear. I do think, like, with this new legislation, it is very clearly targeting people who use drugs. So we've just seen that supervised consumption sites will be shut down through Bill 223. Now with Bill 224, what's being layered on is that if you use drugs in public, you will be liable to be criminalized. And so it's not even that they need to see you using drugs. You don't even need to necessarily have any evidence that somebody's been using drugs. It's merely the suspicion. And that can lead to someone being essentially displaced from wherever they are immediately as one of the remedies, which is to say that you can actually be removed from your encampment. You can be asked to move along. And then what happens to your encampment? Probably someone's going to come and tear it down and throw it out. So in this case as well, it's like, okay, so you just shut down these life-saving services. which was somewhere that people could go inside and use drugs. We should have been expanding this, just as we should be expanding treatment to scale, along with housing. Those three pillars should be expanded to scale. But in this case, we're really just tearing these things apart and ensuring that, of course, people are going to be using drugs in public. Where else are they going to use them? Or they're going to use them in the Tim Hortons bathroom or in the shopping mall. Are you going to make that some minimum wage employee's responsibility to now tack on dealing with overdoses as part of their job? It's actually ludicrous. I'm actually trying to get the business community on board with this, because it should not be their responsibility as well. It shouldn't be any of our responsibility, but that's exactly what they're doing. So again, you're liable to be criminalized if you are caught using drugs in public. But where are you going to go? Again, no treatment, jail. And that seems to be the only alternative here. If they're not embedding, and $75.5 million for things like shelter and the Canada Ontario Housing Benefit, which is a rent supplement that you can use in the private market, it's peanuts. It's peanuts. Our shelter system in the city of Toronto is almost $800 million. So $75.5 million across the entire province is not going to get you very far. What is that, like 5 beds, essentially? Like, it's not going to do anything. So in this case, you're not going to build a shelter, no treatment centers. Jail is the alternative. And so we actually have seen the Ford government make an announcement that they are hoping to expand at least one facility in Eastern Ontario, which will include 250 additional beds. Now, that's not a lot, but that is the one place where they've actually said they are going to build something. So is that the plan? Maybe, but that again costs money. And I have a feeling again that we don't have enough room in jails either. They're not actually going to commit enough money to build more prisons. This is just to show that they are, as Jeff said, tough guys during the election and leverage this issue in a horrifying way to essentially win votes. Now, I also think that it's not as popular as they think it is. People hate encampments. I know that. They do. But most people also realize that unless you actually have housing for people to go, it doesn't get rid of the problem. So I think they're kind of playing a bit of a wild card here. I don't know how successful they'll be, and certainly I'll be there the whole way fighting them on this. But that's essentially what the legislation says. It also will remove encampments within 24 hours if someone receives a notice. That's currently counter to our bylaws. In Toronto, for example, you're supposed to give at least 2 weeks notice. In this case, 24 hours.
So the case is it's funny because all they did was amend the Trespass Act.
Yeah.
The case law does not deal with the Trespass Act at all. It doesn't rely on that, and certainly the charter still applies to the Trespass Act. So we're not worried about that. The thing that worries us more is they're trying to coerce municipalities into carrying out unlawful evictions by withholding funding for their homeless prevention money, which is I think $700 million. Like, it's real money. The new money they brought in is nothing, but the existing money could be a problem. And so in York Region, for example, the region is quite sophisticated about homelessness and does not carry out encampment evictions for the most part. And so they will be pressured into carrying out evictions, notwithstanding that the law has not changed. Waterloo is still the law. The government did not change that. So there will be it'll be hard for us to defend them all if they all start doing it, and we're certainly hoping they don't. Can I just say, so I think what we need to do is to create 100,000 housing units for these folks, and so without sort of preempting, in looking at what I've seen around, I think tiny cabins are the best alternative that I've seen, and there are 8 municipalities that are piloting them right now. And the great thing is, if you talk to Jeff Wilmer at a Better Tent City in Kitchener, for example, the homeless folks like them. He said the biggest problem, and it's the oldest and best one in Canada, I think, and largely run by the residents. But anyway, he said the biggest problem they have is getting people to leave, because they intended it to be transitional, but that because when people go there, they have such a sense of community with the other people staying there. They're so helpful to each other. You mentioned drug overdoses. They all carry naloxone and deal with overdoses themselves. The staff don't even have to get involved. That people say it's better for their mental health to stay there than to move to an empty apartment.
Transitional housing, Jeff, this is just, again, no facts, my opinion. It's a bit of a myth, right? Because I think it's something we do so we can cover stuff over the short term. So we do it. I have before. And I remember coming into this work early on with youth transitional housing and asking where the workers are like, hey man, where do they transition to? So, well, back to the shelter. So it's just like cyclical. Because again, I'm in an apartment, I've just built community, as you said. We also know that in the shelter system, in the encampment system, with encampments, it is community. It's not just about four walls and a roof, as you all said at the very beginning. It is about community. So you say, and we've done this, we've been guilty at Blue Door in the past, and now hopefully we do better, but we're like, all right, we're going to take Jeff and we're going to put him in this house, and everything's going to be great. He can afford it. And then I see you 3 weeks later because I took away your family, right? Like I had staff that were like, hey, how are you doing? I care about you. I had friends. I had meals with people, and then you put me in this lonely environment, right? So it's not just about that. So you have to create this community too. But I think the whole, you don't want them to stay forever, but where do they go? And there's not anything beyond that. And they built this community. So maybe we're fooling ourselves, and we should just build these kind of permanent types of structures.
That's sort of what we've been sort of thinking. I mean, transitional housing often becomes permanent housing. So I really liked what Jeff said about it being an unserious approach right now. And, it's really disappointing, although not necessarily surprising. This is a moment where we really need the levels of government to coordinate and to really be serious about the plans for permanent housing for folks. And it's just such a bit, it's very concerning at this point that there's these unserious sort of approaches being taken. But again,
I can tell you, some people criticize me for endorsing tiny cabins, saying that they're sheds. People shouldn't have to live that way. And I think we'll be doing well if we can get them sheds in the next 5 to 10 years. And I regret, because we used to give them apartments, and I've lowered my standards, saying, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But the last thing I read about new social housing in Toronto, they were saying it was going to cost $500,000 a unit to build, and it takes several years. And most of that housing, of course, you have to have income far beyond social assistance to be able to afford the rent. And so, to me, instead of $500,000 for a unit, you can build a tiny cabin and put it on site for $40,000. And if we need 100,000 units, I think we need to sharpen our pencils really tightly. And again, I regret that that I've lowered my standards for what people should be entitled to. But I just think we have to also be serious and say, what is the government realistically going to fund? And they're not going to fund a $500,000 apartment for 100,000 people, unfortunately. So it's like, well, let's get on with something then. And again, we've got 8 municipalities, so it's what are they? We've got I wrote them down here somewhere. Oh, I can't find it. So we've got Waterloo, Kitchener, Peterborough, Chatham, St. Thomas, Hamilton, Brockville, Thunder Bay, London, and Sarnia. Looking at them, one of the neat things in Peterborough, where they opened a tiny cabin village over where there was an encampment, same tenants, and the police reported that calls for service from the police declined by 96%. If you put people in a place where where they're treated like humans, they're going to act like humans. And the other thing that I think that most, again, unserious conservative politicians don't realize is most shelters kick you out during the day. So they don't want them out and about. Well, if they have a tiny cabin and they've got a TV in there and a video game and they can visit with friends, you won't see them, which I am appalled again that we are like that. But realistically, that's one of the things the politicians are responding to say we want them out of sight. Well, they'll be out of sight if they give them a tiny cabin village.
I'm a bit mixed on this, and for the reasons you just outlined, it's not sufficient as housing. But I'm actually more concerned about how we build these tiny cabin communities, and I think Peterborough did it right, where they actually engaged with the folks living in encampments and the broader community to create a solution that worked for everybody. And that's important, right? If we're talking about human rights here, you have to do that engagement and make it meaningful, and also ensure that your solutions do fit what people are telling you. So I think in the case of Peterborough, we've seen a more ideal way of enacting a tiny home community. And I would like to just see that process embedded in whatever solutions that we come up with in the future, which can include other communities, but whatever they are, it should be ensuring that we are listening in a good way to what people are telling us.
Love that. It's nothing for us without us, right? That kind of.
Yeah, and that's the law. And our law in Canada is you can't force someone to go and live somewhere if they don't want to.
They do it.
Yeah, and so you got to make a place that they want to go live in. And so if you find that model, it's like, go for it. But no, absolutely, it has to be informed by the ultimate users. And sometimes I see people trying to set us off against each other, saying, well, If you are critical of shelters and saying some people can't stay there, you're dissing shelter workers, and it's like not at all.
No.
No, they do extraordinary work, but some people cannot stay there. They would rather stay in a leaky cold tent than go there. So let's ask them why. What's going to take to get them to move out of the park?
Well, certainly in our shelters as well. Sometimes you have, floors of 100 people and you have 2 workers. That's not a safe or sufficient staffing ratio right there, right? So, it's not a diss on the staff. It's a diss on the whole infrastructure and how poorly it's been thought out.
Well, one thing I can say, my board chair describes me as a determined institutionalist, and it is true. I think that ultimately our institutions best serve our most vulnerable people, despite the evidence to the contrary. And I think that politicians at the end of the day are like what Churchill said of Americans, that they can always be counted upon to do the right thing after trying everything else.
Well,
that's where we're at.
This is the whole thing about this legislation. We haven't tried everything. So the notwithstanding clause is so premature. It's ridiculous.
Absolutely.
We haven't tried anything at all.
It's pretty basic, right? I mean, even if people don't know, the question is that someone in the community is like, so where are they going to go? So it's really that basic with this. Now, Diana, you've been going to council meetings throughout Ontario and talking with, what are you hearing from, and with some success too, right? With people agreeing.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me. I mean, when you're in Toronto, you're so stuck in your just snotty little Toronto urban bubble. That's a fact. This is who we are. I know that. But it's actually interesting to venture into all these different communities where actually it seems like many more people seem to understand. In fact, I know the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness put out a poll through Abacus recently that showed that Toronto is the least responsive to approaching encampments in a good way. They're the most on board with evicting them. And that's a bit of a reversal, I think, from what people think, that we're such progressive leaders and, we set the tone. Well, maybe that's sometimes true, but in this case, it's showing that actually the most support comes from outside the GTA. And in fact, in the north, in Northern Ontario, people understand this, I think, in a really deep way, because they've been cut off from necessary life-saving infrastructure for so long, and services and ER closures, et cetera, that the complete disregard for northern communities, you see that they're actually far more on board with just build the housing. We don't need this kind of legislation. Whereas, I would say definitely in Toronto, that kind of sentiment is declining. And now we're actually seeing an organized lobby come to community meetings around building shelters, for example. So as much as we need them, we're also facing a huge fight from community members who will do whatever they can to block them, and are now raising tens of thousands of dollars in order to do that. So I'll just say that right now, at least it's the other communities that are giving me hope, because we've seen good things in Brant County. We've seen good things in Guelph. Hamilton is not a small community, obviously, but Hamilton as well. And I hope that those other communities will actually lead the charge where Toronto is sadly failing.
So unfortunately, it's true when municipalities say that they can't afford to do it all by themselves, because they are limited to property taxes as a source of revenue, which Premier Ford could change tomorrow if he wanted to. It's under the Municipal Act. But they can't afford to do it. The person who can afford to do it is Premier Ford. And municipalities, by and large, are not saying, give us notwithstanding. As I said, there was no interest from municipalities in that. What they're saying is, give us money to build housing. We want to house them. So at some point, hopefully somebody will get through to them. And I think that a lot of small town mayors are pretty conservative and have his ear. And hopefully at some point they can get through to him to say, look, we just got to get going on this. It's just going to get worse. We have this dystopian world, and I think, unfortunately, that people have normalized it and think that, well, it's too bad that we have this dystopia, but it's kind of inevitable, and it's the way it is. And it's like, well, that's not the way it is. This is only the last 5 or 6 years, for starters, and Ontario's wealthier than it ever has been. Its GDP is higher than it ever has been. We're not poor. We can afford to continue to house our most vulnerable people the way we always have, in the way that Canadians want to. But somehow our politicians just don't hear that.
I think, and it's all politics. It's all politics. He doesn't want to change the deal between municipalities and the province. He does not want to change the funding formula, which is a source of a lot of this trouble, right? Because we all pay our taxes to the province, but we don't get it back. It's not invested into the services that we need. So property taxes have to be hiked up to accommodate the kinds of services that people require in municipalities. And that is exactly it. People get mad at the municipality. They don't get mad at the province for that because they don't draw the connection.
Yeah, I'll make
And
that connection.
well, that gives them more power, right? If you denigrate municipalities, that consolidates provincial power, and that's exactly what he wants.
Well, and this gets to sort of how the rights-based approach can help. It says maximum available resources to to housing. So I understand that there's a lot of, it's very costly to, in particular, build housing. There's other options like acquiring housing, but we've got to really focus on, this is a great need. We also know the reasons that we've gotten to this housing affordability shortage, and we can go back and learn from that and fix it moving forward. So it would just be, to preempt the next question, what can we do? We really need to be serious and have serious solutions and demand that the resources are allocated the way that they need to be. And, for our part at CCHR, a big part of that too is keeping people housed where they are. And we have seen some municipalities allocating more resources to eviction prevention programs, which is another key part. It's about getting people who are currently homeless and in living encampments into the permanent housing they need, but then keeping people that are really vulnerable. And that's a huge priority of ours. Just how do we keep people where they are? How do we prevent financialized acquisitions? Or if that needs to happen, how do we find places for people to go? Because one of the biggest issues that I started seeing when I was working directly with renters was just increasingly people were saying to us, where do I go? People used to get evicted and that was awful, but where do I go? And we started saying, we're not sure. We don't know. There used to be a program in Toronto called Landlord Connect that would connect lower income people with landlords. And that program just stopped existing because there was no connection to be made. So that was a huge sort of alarm bell that went off for us several years ago.
Well, I can tell in York Region, the region, again, as I said, I think is doing their best. And one of the things they do is they give us almost $400,000 a year to defend evictions into homelessness. So they're very aware that it's far cheaper to keep someone housed than it is to have them become unhoused and get them rehoused. Having said that, again, the province could do some very useful things. One would be to bring back rent control between tenancies, which we used to have, to take away the incentive of landlords to evict low-income tenants in order to double the rent and get somebody else in there. That would be a massive improvement. But again, the government seems to have no interest in that.
Well, thank you all for your time. Just thank you for educating us, breaking it down, sharing solutions, what we could possibly do moving forward. So appreciated. You're all brilliant at doing life-saving and changing work. I'm just going to say, if people want to find out more about your organization or they want to contact you, where do they go? Annie, we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah. Our website, www.housingrightscanada.com. And then we also have, we're active on LinkedIn and X, Twitter, mostly. We also have a Facebook account. And I would recommend, if people are interested, they can join our newsletter. In particular, our team does a policy roundup every month where they try to summarize some of the key housing policy developments across Canada.
Thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, so we're a community legal clinic of York Region. Our website, clcyr.on.ca. It happens that I also have a Twitter account that I spend quite a bit of time on, where I curate the news basically about housing and homelessness issues daily across Canada. Post 6 or 7 stories a day, and my Twitter account is Jeff_Schlemmer_. So feel free to follow that if you want to keep up on what's happening.
For me, I mean, I just do my own thing. I am with The Shift. You can look up maketheshift.org. So that would be the organization I'm working for right now. But just Google my name, honestly. Diana Chan McNally. I'm the only one in the world apparently at the moment. There's a lot of Diana McNallys, but not Chan McNallys. I'm on X. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Blue Sky. Everything.
You are not hard to find.
Not hard to find.
That's for sure. Well, thank you all for taking the time for what you do on a daily basis. And you're always welcome back. So hopefully we'll see you again on the way home.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.